The Lives of the Saints by Father Alban Butler. December 2nd. Blessed John van Ruysbroeck. Jan van Ruysbroeck, or Juan Rusbroeck as he is generally called in English, was born in Ruysbroeck, near Brussels, in 1293. At the time, the present city was a small village. Surely the parents of the future blessed were humble people, although, to tell the truth, we know nothing about his father, and about his mother, we only know that she was very good and loved her son tenderly. At the age of 11, John went to live with his uncle John Hinckaert, who was a minor canon of the Collegiate Church of St. Gudula in Brussels. The boy went to school in that city. Some years later, his mother also went to live in a beguinage in Brussels. Shortly after her death, John was ordained to the priesthood at the age of 24. After some time, as a result of a sermon he had heard at St. Gudula's, Canon Hinckaert changed his life considerably. Indeed, he distributed all his superfluous goods among the poor, and in the company of another canon named Franco van Coudenberg, who was younger than he began to devote more and more time to contemplation in the midst of his life as a canon. Blessed John soon joined them. Between 1330 and 1335, he wrote some polemical pamphlets that are not preserved, but soon after he wrote the Book of the Kingdom of the Lovers of God, a work that, like all the Blessed's other works, was written in Flemish, with the intention that the people could read it. It is a refutation of false mysticism, and an exposition of the true way of God. It was followed by the Spirituals, and several other works of practical mysticism. Some commentators claim that John was literate and ignorant, thus adding interest to the merit of his writings, but in reality, it is proven that he was a very capable philosopher and theologian, and that he was well acquainted with the works of the scholastics of his time and of the great masters of the past. For the rest, the hypothesis that John was an illiterate was launched since his time. Gerson, who accused him of having fallen into pantheism in The Spirituals, replied to the authors of the hypothesis, "It has been said that the author of this book is unlettered and ignorant to be able to consider his work as inspired by the Holy Spirit. But in reality, he gives more proof of human wisdom than of divine inspiration. His style is somewhat studied. Besides, to speak on a subject like that, piety is not enough, but one must also have studied." Between 1340 and 1343, Rusbroeck wrote the first part of the Book of the Spiritual Tabernacle, which is an allegory of the mystical life. In the spring of the following year, the three priests left Brussels. Indeed, they felt called to dedicate themselves completely to God in the contemplative life, and expressed their desire to retire to the solitude of the countryside, since in the city they felt enslaved and oppressed by the other clerics, many of whom were worldly and unpious, and among whom John had provoked hostility by the vigor of his fight against heresy. At that time, Canon van Coudenberg was in difficulties with the Duke of Brabant, John III, and the latter, to counteract the canon, authorized the monks of the hermitage of St. Lambert in Groenendael to cede a plot of land in the woods of Sogne to those who aspired to the solitary life. There the three friends settled and built a larger chapel. During the first 6 years, they were much criticized by the chapter of St. Gudula and the monks of the surrounding area, and the Duke used to organize hunting parties in those parts. As they were not associated with any religious order, they had no way of protecting themselves. So, in 1349, when they already had 5 disciples, they formed a community of canons, regular of St. Augustine, and took their vows before the Bishop of Cambrai. The elder Hinckaert died the following year. Franco van Coudenberg was elected superior of the monastery, and John Rusbroeck prior. Franco was, as it were, the founder of Groenendael in the material and administrative sense, while John's presence in the monastery attracted the numerous aspirants who entered the community. Rusbroeck was an exemplary religious, docile, patient, obedient, and a lover of manual labor, in which he was rather clumsy. In a word, he was a better subject than superior. Gerard Naghel, a Carthusian of Rennes, tells how Rusbroeck came to visit his monastery. How much more could I say about that powerful and virile face, sweetened by joy, about his humble and affectionate conversation, about the spirituality that radiated from his person, about his very religious attitude, which was manifested even in the way he dressed. Although we wanted him to speak to us about himself, we never succeeded, for he always spoke to us about the sacred epistles. He was as free from pride as if he had never written works as good as his own. Blessed John used to spend whole hours in the forest surrounding the monastery to listen to the voice of God in that place where human distractions did not come between him and his Creator. He used to take notes on wax tablets and then arrange and develop them in his cell. On one occasion, Mo appeared at lunchtime, and one of the canons went out to look for him. He found him wrapped in ecstasy, seated and surrounded by a heavenly light. There he completed the spiritual tabernacle and wrote the other works that made him one of the greatest contemplatives of the Middle Ages. It has been said that Rusbroeck said nothing that other mystics had not already said, and that his originality consists in his way of presenting things. But to say something in a new way is always equivalent to saying something new. On the other hand, since Rusbroeck lived between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, he combined the philosophical elements of scholasticism with Neoplatonic elements. It has been rightly said that if Rusbroeck had not brought a personal point of view, and if his doctrine had not had anything original, his extraordinary influence would be inexplicable. It is true that his personal holiness is sufficient to explain why the most heterogeneous mobs went on pilgrimage to Groenendael to see him. But Rusbroeck also exercised great influence on others, who were doctors a clerici non mediocres, the principal of whom was Gerard Groete, founder of the Brothers of the Common Life. Through him, the doctrine of the Blessed made its influence felt on the school of Windesheim and Thomas of Kempis. It can also be said that Groenendael's monastic way of life explains why Windesheim did not become a Carthusian or Cistercian, but an Augustinian. In the last years of his life, Blessed John could no longer leave the cell he shared with Franco van Coudenberg, who was even older than he. One night, Blessed John dreamed of his mother, who told him that God was going to call him during Advent. The next day, he asked to be transferred to the infirmary, where, consumed by fever, he prepared himself with all lucidity and devotion for death. God called him to himself on December 2nd, 1391, at the age of 88. From then on the second Sunday after Pentecost, the chapter of St. Gudula held processions to Groenendael in honor of John Rusbroeck. When the monastery was suppressed in 1783, the relics of the Blessed were transferred to Brussels, but disappeared during the Revolution. The efforts that had been made to obtain his beatification, so often interrupted, were finally crowned with success in 1908, since St. Pius X confirmed the cult of the Blessed and granted the celebration of his feast to the canons regular of the Lateran and the Diocese of Mechelen. Abbot Cuthberto Butler is of the opinion that there is probably no greater contemplative than Rusbroeck, and certainly there has been no greater mystical writer.